You always have to shout to be loud.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Kevin Fellezs. Kevin is a dear colleague and friend, and he is also right now the director of Jazz Studies, the Jazz Studies Center at Columbia University, and professor of music and African American studies. Kevin is the author of many books and articles. Just to name a few: Listen But Don't Ask, Hawaiian Slack Key Guitar Across the Pacific Atlantic, and Birds of Fire, Jazz, Rock, Funk, and the Creation of Fusion. And today, Kevin is going to talk about animal musicality. So I'm very intrigued and very excited, and I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks. Hear me? Do I need the microphone?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to join you today. I've already learned a lot, and I plan on learning a lot more on the next day and a half. So my talk today, learning to listen with empathy. I was asked to present a talk on the topic, Introduction to Soundscapes, or as the organizer's initial invitation put it, a lecture on how to listen. Before I launch into my talk proper, I confess that I'm not going to speak on the central theme of this conference, namely the Luso-Hispanic encounter in South Asia. While I lack any expertise in that particular history and have no desire to prove it to all of you today, I have been interested in musical fusions and transnational circulations of musical traditions, and the ways in which both of those phenomena have articulated local and global mixings that speak to the impure, the mixed up, the polycultural. All symptomatic of cultures in constant flux, of histories always being made and remade, and that we are creatures who crave both stability and change, simultaneously respecting tradition and applauding innovation in some measure. In my work, I've tended to focus on the role of musicians and their aesthetic choices in creating those messy, heterogeneous articulations. However, in my current project, I reverse my usual attention on musicians to think about listening, the flip side of an oral relationship sustained by musicking, to argue for a more expansive sense of listening that is attentive to non-anthropogenic musicking and sound beings writ large. In using the term musicking, I borrow from Christopher Small, who argues convincingly that music is a verb, not a noun, and that gerunding the term allows us to see how the activity of music making involves not just the musician, but everything that can be brought in to consider the overall context of a given musical performance, including the way musicians and audience may dress, for example, or the type of performance space deemed suitable. Most significantly for my talk today, Small writes, quote, "The act of musicking establishes in the place where it is happening a set of relationships, and it is in those relationships that the meaning of the act lies. They are to be found not only between those organized sounds which are conventionally thought of as being the stuff of musical meaning, but also between the people who are taking part in whatever capacity in the performance. And they model or stand as metaphor for ideal relationships as the participants in the performance imagine them to be. Relationships between person and person, between individual and society, between humanity and the natural world, and even perhaps the supernatural world. These are important matters, perhaps the most important in human life," end quote. I'm interested today in thinking through the role of listening in the fulsome act of musicking Small describes by turning to the relationship between humanity and the natural world, in the hope that listening to our non-human animal others can help us mitigate the conditions that have come to define the Anthropocene, the term we have given to the current era of human accelerated global climate change. Stepping back a moment, as I considered accepting the invitation to join you here, I immediately thought of two ways in which conventional ideas about music contribute to the ways US Americans listen. I first thought of the way I began my initial lecture in my African American music course by having the students listen to a number of audio clips without seeing any images of the artist. This semester, I began with Kendrick Lamar's DNA, followed by the second movement of the George Walker piece, Sonata No. 1 for piano, punk band Bad Brains' Walk for Light, and Johnny Mathis's It's Not For Me to Say, among a number of other recordings. Prefaced with the question, what is Black music? Or is this Black music? If so, why? If not, why not? They began by responding emphatically yes to Lamar, citing his racial background. They didn't need to see him to recognize his voice, and the genre in which he operates as support for their view. Though by the third example, after informing them that the classical piece was composed by the first Black composer to be awarded a Pulitzer, and that the punk band is an all-Black unit, they became increasingly hesitant to answer, particularly to the second question about the rationale for assigning the music a racialized label. And students, many of whom were confident minutes ago that they listened and knew all kinds of music, I listen to everything is a common refrain, began realizing that they have ears trained to hear music in particular ways, and therefore capable of a particular range of evaluations. The final selection this semester was Elaine Brown's The Meeting from her 1970 folk recording, Seize the Time, which was produced to raise funds for the Black Panther Party, which she led from 1974 to 77. But her musicking sounds more like Joan Baez than Aretha Franklin. Decidedly not Black music to most of my students, especially Black students, even after they learn about the song's history and see the record cover. And usually after playing the clip and eliciting an initial response, I showed them the artist and talk about more. I won't play that parlor game with all of you today, but it led me to a second thought, which is that much of our conversations about the soundscape revolve around conventional music genres and traditions, as well as different communities of human sound makers. An anthropocentric notion of music that I hope to dispel by making a case for expanding our sense of listening to include the more than human. Even in expansive notions of the soundscape, most surveys indicate people remain anthropocentric in the main, citing, for example, those noisy neighbors next door, traffic noise, the conversational hum of a restaurant, or what Anahid Kasabian termed ubiquitous musics, such as music. In contrast, my talk is based on some early thoughts brought on by a new project in which I consider non-human animal musicality, and by extension, non-human animal sentience, in order to consider how we might listen to them empathetically, despite obvious obstacles such as an inability to engage them in meaningful linguistic dialogue. I mean to suggest that our relationship to the natural world, as Small put it, resonates with the way we humans hear one another across difference. We share a world, a complex biosphere we call home, with what Indigenous studies scholars call more than human. A naming of the so-called natural world that calls into question our often taken for granted assumption of biological and ontological superiority, our species' hegemony, if you will. Part of what makes it so difficult for us to hear the more than human is that we have separated ourselves from the rest of the biosphere. Philosopher Melanie Challenger notes, quote, "Many of our most common beliefs spring from an underlying refusal to accept that we are organic beings. The truth is that being human is being animal," end quote. Richard Powers, the author of The Overstory, a best-selling novel in which the plot turns on the fact that trees and humans share a common ancestor and up to a quarter of our respective genes, asks in exasperation, how did we lose our sense of living here on Earth? How did we become so alienated and estranged from everything else alive? A bracing acknowledgement of the absurd yet logical endpoint of our collective belief in human domination of the entire planet. Zoomusicologist Dario Martinelli posits that our anthropocentric view of the so-called natural world is more than simply alienation, noting, quote, "Anthropocentrism interprets nature as an entity existing apart from and for the benefit of humans, so that B, nothing in nature can be considered in itself autonomously from humans, and C, It is ethically acceptable for humans and non-humans to be treated in different ways, end quote. In my current project, I focus on humanity's impact in the Pacific Ocean and will be attempting to listen to 3 mammals: the California sea otter, the Hawaiian monk seal, and the Japanese sei whale. My hypothesis moving into this project is that they hold understandings of the sea, which can help heal our relationship with the ocean, and by extension, the larger biosphere, including human-to-human relationships. We have rarely been good companions of the deep. In her provocative book, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, poet and essayist Alexis Pauline Gumbs writes about the giant sea mammal, the Hydrodamus gigas, or Siberian sea cow, a Sirenian who swam the Bering Sea. Within 27 years of its discovery in 1741, the species was extinct, hunted for its value as food for ship's crews sailing to hunt sea otters and beavers for fur along the North American west coast. Gumbs writes, quote, "They say she couldn't sing. The only sound was her breathing, but she could hear for miles and miles and miles. What a loss for listening." Now she addresses the Siberian sea cow directly. "How can we honor it, the archive of your breathing? Does it make anyone feel better to know that your extinction, the first known extinction of a marine mammal caused by humans, was collateral in the pursuit of other deaths? Oh, you rough mermaid, what are you teaching us about breath? Oh, massive vegetarian, what do we do now that our listening is that much smaller? What can I do to honor you now that it is too late? I will say, once upon a time, there was a huge and quiet swimmer, a plant-based, rough-skinned listener, a fat and graceful mammal. And then I will be quiet, so I can hear you breathing. And then I will be breathing, and you'll remind me, do not rush. And the time in me will hush, and then we will be listening for real," end quote. We swim with the ghost of the giant Bering sea cow to remind us of the urgency of shaping new kinds of relationships across difference in these deep blue waters, and by extension, in the terrestrial world to which we eventually return. Our lives depend on our ability to listen across and beneath the waters, keeping our own mouths shut and our ears open to all those strange, wondrous creatures. In order to repair our relationship with our swimming companions, such as the giant Bering sea cow, in order to hear her breathing, we need to hold our breath and simply listen. How can we listen across species, across extinction, across harm? One strategy is to be silent in order to try and hear what our oceanic cousins might be telling us. Gumbs advises, quote, "This is where we start our trans-species communion, opening a space to uplift the practice of listening even more than the practices of showing and proving and speaking up. Listening is not only about the normative ability to hear, it is a transformative and revolutionary resource that requires quieting down and tuning in," end quote. I want to emphasize her call to non-action, to quieting down and tuning in to these sea mammals as completely opaque ways of sensing and interacting with the world. And here I'm drawing from just a bunch of studies in science around the fact that animals have other ways of accessing information. Right? This room, for instance, would feel very differently if we were spiders, right, or dogs, even, right? We would access information about this room very differently. But we have not listened in the humble way that Gumbs asks us to. Tragically, our collective impact is marked by a loud, violent sonic hubris, proving catastrophic for oceanic life and by extension our own. Marine biologist Carlos M. Duarte, writing in the February 2021 issue of the journal Science, reminds us that, quote, "Oceans have become substantially noisier since the Industrial Revolution. Shipping, resource exploration, and infrastructure development have increased the anthrophony, or sounds generated by human activities, whereas the biophony, or sounds of biological origin, has been reduced by hunting, fishing, and habitat degradation. Climate change is affecting geophony, abiotic natural sounds. Existing evidence shows that anthrophony affects marine animals at multiple levels, including their behavior, physiology, and in extreme cases, survival," end quote. Oceanic human-produced noise pollution, in other words, is a threat to biodiversity, including the ultimate health of the oceans, our planet's lungs, as the adage goes. A liquid space that allows all of us to live in a temperate, life-giving planet in which we currently swim. As a matter of fact, we speak of the cloud and cloud computing and the virtual world brought about by computer technologies, or we think of satellites and cellular telecommunications. But it would be more accurate to speak of ocean computing, because that is where the bulk of our internet cables are located, and which connect us to each other globally. Yet it is equally true, as Duarte's remarks imply, that the ocean is not a silent space. Science writer Sabrina Embler observes, quote, "A healthy ocean is not a silent ocean. Hail crackling into white-crested waves, glaciers thudding into water, gases bubbling from hydrothermal vents, and countless creatures chittering, rasping, and singing are all signs of a normal ocean environment. In the ocean, visual cues disappear after tens of yards, and chemical cues dissipate after hundreds of yards. But sound can travel thousands of miles and link animals across oceanic basins and in darkness. As a result, many marine species are impeccably adapted to detect and communicate with sound. Dolphins call one another by unique names. Toadfish hum, bearded seals trill, whales sing, end quote. The point I want to make is that this alien wet world is not a silent one, even deep below the surface. The marine sounds alert us to the presence of our oceanic others, the natural inhabitants of the sea. We who swim its waters know it as both home and not home, a space of welcome and threat alike, and thus a space in which we humans might learn some humility, or at least the awareness of our individual limitations in the face of our own oceanic otherness. How do we hear them then? How many of us can identify a whale from its song, a seal by its barks, a dolphin by its dolphin-given name? And could we translate their sounds even if we were able to? Of course, it doesn't take more than a second or two of reflection to begin noting our familiarity, at least conceptually, with a host of non-human animal soundings. Bird song, bird calls, whale song, the howling of wolves, the sounds of crickets and summer cicadas, our pet dog's barks and whimpers, our pet cat's meows and purrings, the mooing of cattle and dairy cows, the neighing and winging of horses, the clucking of chickens, the oinking and grunting of domesticated pigs. Allow me an additional wrinkle for consideration. The animal sounds I just listed are the ways in which Anglophone listeners hear those animals. Human oral perception is not universal, even if ubiquitous. For instance, my Japanese grandmother would hear cats vocalizing meow meow rather than meow meow, while dogs vocalize as wang wang rather than ruff ruff. A human difference in hearing, which I mean to continue to have lingering in the background of my talk today. And I'm guessing many of you have familiarity with the way animals sound in other languages besides English and Japanese. Right? Arguably, these animal soundings do not often play much of a role in our broad conceptualizations of the soundscape, particularly those of us who live in urban settings. But the cooing of pigeons or the hoo-wooing of mourning doves is familiar even to city dwellers. We were recently given a hint of the possibilities of listening to our more than human cohabitants of this planet. The early days of the pandemic reminded us of the richness of non-human sounds, as people noticed birdsong much more effortlessly in the quiet of largely inactive cityscapes. And animals such as sheep and wild goats entered vacant towns and villages, buying and bleeding their way on those human emptied lanes. In other words, as Gunn suggests, one place to begin to listen is by simply being quiet and allowing our cohabitants the space to gather, to comment, to help us return to a sense of a shared biosphere. Our re-entry into the ocean waters reminds us of our immersion in the biosphere, calling up the ways in which we are not external to the so-called natural world. Yet we currently live in a world in which biodiversity is shrinking. The otherness that completes us as co-inhabitants of our shared biosphere is rapidly disappearing. And again, we are not simply innocent observers in this tragedy. It is our focus on a human as more than animal identity, which limits our capacity for dealing with interspecies difference. That also speaks to our difficulties with intraspecies difference. I want us to think about our listening habits in relationship to the ways in which the sounds we create as a species, in other words, the sounds we produce collectively, and its deleterious impact on the more than human. We need to reconsider the ways we have not only dominated the landscape, but the soundscape as well. To begin listening with empathy across the interspecies divide requires us to dive below the surface, beyond the breakers, and into the deep. Before entering the waters, I want to be clear. When I speak of an approach to listening that is reparative and empathetic, it requires a reconception of the relationship between human and more than human. That offers us a glimpse of the kinds of human-to-human relationships, individual and collective, that we might build on in order to meet the challenges of a planet with a rapidly changing climate. I take reparative in its meaning as repair or remedy, as curative. I'll expand on what I mean by empathy later in my talk, but I want to be clear. Empathy is not identity or identification with. It is a reaching across difference through a hopefully mutual recognition of shared values, often only sensed and not explicitly articulated, especially with non-human animals or with people with whom we don't share a language, and leaves room for mistaken overreach or failings of apprehension. But empathy is a move toward otherness enacted in good faith. I attach politics in the broadest sense possible to mean public social interactions interlaced with meaning and power, and articulated in what I'm calling the sonic oceanic. Ultimately, I want to think about repairing our relationship to the larger biosphere and the ways in which listening to our oceanic mammalian kin can help us think through our current predicament. A planet in which human activity has accelerated climate change in ways that are not only catastrophic for human life, but for many of our biotic and abiotic sisters and brothers as well. The 2021 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report on the state of affairs mentioned, quote, 22 animals and 1 plant should be declared extinct and removed from the endangered species list, end quote. To provide some historical context for that stunning statistic, there had been only 11 species declared extinct in the entire half century since the signing of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. Right, so in a single year, double the amount of extinctions occurred that had happened the previous 48 years at that point. Let us now drop into the waters. Water no longer rushes past your ear. You are in the water, in its ear, enfolded within its presence. Yet you can still hear the water, listening to it as it blows past you, a liquid wind passing with the current, with the current. Fish fly past you, some eyeing you furtively before quickly fleeting off into the distance. Their speed and agility and the overwhelming power of the water impress, while deflating any sense of comparison. It is physically draining to simply maintain one's balance or sense of control over one's movement in the ever-moving fluid, the oceanic currents tossing and turning your body effortlessly. You can hear your own presence in this liquid atmosphere, floating, but not without great effort, simultaneously gliding and propelling yourself through the wet space. As Håkan Sarngren notes, quote, the sea is unquestionably part of nature, but as an environment foreign or even hostile to humans, it is also a counter nature when seen from an anthropocentric perspective. Human beings cannot absorb the oxygen in water. The high pressure makes it impossible for humans to venture freely into the depths. Water resistance and viscosity reduce our mobility in water, and water's cooling capacity makes it unfeasible for us to stay immersed more than briefly, end quote. Sandgren does not mention this, but as a swimmer in open seawater, you have re-entered the food chain, a terrestrial weak link in an oceanic chain of being. This is a counter nature which is fraught with danger as much as it is a space of sustenance and pleasure. While certainly humbled by our vulnerability, immersed in an environment in which humans are ill-equipped to survive, how can we even begin to hear our mammalian cousins, let alone join in any activity that might be called reparative? Sandgren again, quote, since antiquity, stories and encounters with sea creatures have focused on their abnormal appearance and strange behavior. Consequently, the sea not only appears as something foreign in relation to our shared living space, it has come to represent something antithetical to it, something unintelligible. The sea's importance as a counter nature, when seen from man's terrestrial viewpoint, has made it easier for us to use it in an ill-considered and reckless way, as a dumping ground for waste, as an infinite tank for pollutants, and has a seemingly inexhaustible supply of food resources, end quote. We might think of the recent decision by the Japanese government to release radioactive water, right? As it's going to be diluted, so it's benign. Sandgren's implicit call to reintroduce ourselves to the ocean, to its abnormal and strange creatures, speaks to the reparative nature of our rejoining marine life, brief and transitory as it must be. We might take our cues from other mammals who have learned to adapt to the oceanic, acclimating themselves within a medium in which life-giving oxygen is unavailable, and integrating the watery universe into their conception of the world. The Hawaiian monk seal, for example, can remain underwater for up to 20 minutes, diving to depths as far as 550 meters. Still, like Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians, the Hawaiian monk seal faces a dire present with the constant assault of its territory, hindering its ability to live freely as an autonomous subject rather than as an exhibit or resource. Swimming in the deep teaches humility because it recalibrates anthropocentric notions of outsized dominance over the non-human. As mentioned, we are no longer the apex predator in the deep, but become slow, plodding prey, clumsy and lethargic compared to most of the oceanic more than human. Listening in the ocean, we hear the faint calls of our mammalian comrades, the sound of the waves and current as we shift above and below the water's surface, but most of all, we hear our own breathing, bubbling past us as air leaves our bodies. Because it puts us back in touch with the waters and all that it contains, listening while swimming helps connect us to our own humanity, to its limits as well as embeddedness within the larger biosphere, not separate and apart, certainly not dominant, but a small, even insignificant element, especially at the individual level. Still, collectively, our extractive and exploratory activities in the ocean are not benign, nor small and inconsequential. Nor do we often think about the non-musical sounds we produce as we conduct our oceanic business. And we think even less often of its effect on the oceanic more than human. The impact of human activity and its accompanying sounds in the Pacific Ocean, a space historically thought of as empty, particularly of sound as the phrase "the silent deep" indicates, or as dire to non-human mammalian sea life as we are vulnerable at the individual level. Oceanic oil drilling and other extractive industrial processes, oceanic cargo and tourism transportation, the lane of intercontinental communication systems, and oceanic petroleum drilling station construction and deployment is largely unheard by most humans. In contrast, despite the inability of most humans to hear whales' deep oceanic songs, which can travel thousands of miles beneath the surface, they can certainly hear us. As biologist David George Haskell notes, our oceanic cousins are continuously assaulted sonically by noisy shipping lanes, oceanic surveys that use depth charges, the use of dynamite and sonic blasts from meter-long air guns to fish, to the quote, underwater seismic pounding that feeds every one of us who use oil and gas, end quote. Yet as mentioned, most humans never hear any of these activities, even when located on those ships. So now I'm going to turn to the relationship between musicality and sentience and aesthetics and cognition. Darwin spends considerable time in The Origin of Species devoted to birds rather than primates in establishing his argument that human aesthetics descended directly from the selective processes that occurred when animals had the power to choose their own mates, arguing that generations of attracting, being chosen, and having offspring have bred a sense and appreciation of beauty in certain animals. Darwin's theory of evolution arrived in the wake of centuries of European colonial conquest, during which there were heated debates about the status of non-European others they encountered. Questions about whether indigenous populations were fully human or possessed souls were echoed by debates in the late 19th century concerned with the topic of non-human animals' capabilities and what they might mean in terms of defining sentience and its relationship to cognitive abilities. Birdsong, rather than primate vocalizations, was fundamental to Darwin's arguments about the development of human language and music. His well-known debate with early sociologist Herbert Spencer about the reason for the existence of birdsong rested on a fundamental difference of opinion about the nature of animal musicality. To reduce their debate somewhat, Darwin argued that birdsong was the result of generations of females making aesthetic choices and choosing which male singers to mate with, indicating intention and thus sentience. While Spencer relegated birdsong to mindless chatter and cordoned off humans as solely capable of rational sound production. As Rachel Mundy notes, quote, "The stakes of this debate were not merely an argument about evolutionary origins. They were about personhood. For to be a musician, human or animal, was to be a person," end quote. There are whistling languages found across the globe, including the whistled communications in the so-called bird language of northern Turkey, which hint at the connection between music and speech Darwin hypothesized as indicative of aesthetics' fundamental role in biological development, along with its indication of sentience and higher cognitive capabilities. Biologist Haskell is adamant about the fundamental evolutionary role of aesthetics. Quote, "Sexual dynamics among animals are creative forces, diversifying sound. This generative power works in three principal ways, none of them exclusive of the other. The first is the sensory biases of each species. The second is the need to avoid breeding with closely related species. And the third and most creative of all are aesthetic preferences," end quote. Given that birdsong is a partially learned behavior, as is whale song, it means that melodies and pitch and rhythm selections for both, as well as for many other non-human animals, are choices. That these are cultural rather than instinctual, in other words. It is not entirely without reason to assume these non-human musicians are making aesthetic choices. Historically, however, ethologists, denying more than human sentience, maintained a sense of human superiority and distinction from other animals by attributing many animal behaviors to instinct. In other words, ethologists argued that animals acted from biological imperatives rather than being motivated by rational choice. I want to note again that these arguments echo the ideas Europeans held about non-Europeans and the relative aesthetic value of the musicking they encountered. Such ideas led to the hierarchical demarcation of, on one hand, musicology, or the study of European art music, and ethnomusicology, the study of the rest of the world's music, including European folk musics, on the other. Much of the early arguments regarding the music European colonizers encountered were based on ideas that shaped what became known as social Darwinism, which maintained that humans and human groups had innate tendencies that directed their actions, and that there was little an individual could do to overcome her inborn predispositions and proclivities. This view constructed and maintained a cultural hierarchy ranging from primitive other to civilized Europe that was used to justify human dominance over the natural world, just as it sanctioned Europeans over purportedly less developed societies, all defined by European bourgeoisie who saw themselves as the pinnacle of human evolution. Philosopher David Rothenberg, who is also an accomplished jazz clarinetist and performs and records with non-human animals as part of his academic and creative work, rejects this overdetermined role of instinct, arguing instead that when he performs music with a nightingale, for example, it feels like making music in the same way as in any human-only jam session. The nightingale is no simple-minded automaton, exuding sound without intent or as merely territorial calls or mating calls. Rothenberg even detects joy in their bird's interactions. The bird repeats and otherwise responds to Rothenberg's melodic or rhythmic line, which suggests a line for him to pursue. In other words, they are co-creating and coordinating the sounds together. He argues that it is therefore entirely reasonable to think of their shared activity as music making. Rothenberg's jam sessions with non-human animals is a case of interspecies empathy, a sense that he and his more than human collaborators share a sense of purpose and even mutual enjoyment. Rothenberg's activities suggest that there are possibilities for meaningful listening to occur across species difference, but that it requires human participants to disavow any sense of superiority, or that they are in charge of the collaboration. Rothenberg's interspecies musicking suggests, as philosopher Stephen Best argues, that once we see what flimsy, fallacious, and corrupt constructs anthropocentrism and speciesism are, and how deeply embedded they are in the philosophies, values, and narratives of civilization, we can only avoid the worst effects of social and environmental decline by constructing new values, worldviews, narratives, and species identities. Part of reconceiving our human species identity involves reconsidering our positioning above the more than human, and to the particular hierarchical weight we give to intrahuman difference. Again, empathy is not identity. It is rather a reaching across difference. But empathetic listening may also require us to only be reachable and to actively not reach out, to quiet down and tune in as Gums encourages us. Just as we enter the waters of our own accord, we can leave. Another way of simply listening and not saying anything. We can leave the oceans alone, allowing the seas, like those emptied streets during the COVID lockdown period, to reestablish their own equilibrium and returning them to a soundscape less disturbed by human activity. As we climb back on shore, I want to conclude with some thoughts about listening with empathy intraspecially, or human to human, which just might also help us to listen to the echoes of that now extinct Siberian sea cow in the thoughtful and empathetic ways Gums asks us to. Given our history with the more than human, however, not all animals are ready and willing to collaborate with us in the way Rothenberg and his bird musicians have interacted. In a recent experiment, scientists have discovered that for wild mammals on the African savanna, from tiny antelopes to massive elephants, the scariest, most lethal predator of all is us. Playing recordings at near 21 watering holes, sound clips ranging from benign sounds such as bird songs to dogs barking, gunshots, lions snarling, or a human speaking, triggered randomly by motion detectors, 19 different species, including other predators such as leopards and hyenas, and large animals such as giraffes and elephants, immediately fled on hearing human speech. Reactions to the recording of lions, dogs, and even gunshots were much more hesitant. In fact, elephants, who immediately ran from the watering hole on hearing a human voice, actively looked for the lion, destroying some of the equipment in the process. The human voice, moreover, was not yelling, but spoke in conversational tones about rather mundane topics, and were in a variety of languages, including Tsonga, Northern Sotho, Afrikaans, and English. The reactions of these animals speaks to histories of discrepancies and relations of power. As I've been suggesting, interspecies relations among human individuals and institutions have paralleled the anthropocentric view that maintains human superiority over other life forms. But I offer my challenge today to listen empathetically to the more than human as a way to hear more astutely across difference of all kinds, including among and between humans and our collectives. Similar to the animals at the African watering hole who have learned to fear humans, we have histories of violence among our own kind that may not always facilitate empathetic listening. As we contemplate the Luso-Hispanic in India through music, or the encounters between and among human difference writ large, the issue of empathy and cross-cultural overlap, how musicians organize sounds in ways that are similar, for example, as well as distinction, what each member of the jam session can provide that is novelly and productive to the others, not only directs the combinatory musicking that can occur, but also influences the analyses scholars bring to bear and the pleasures in which audiences can partake. We must allow our ears to open up and truly hear, not only to hear what our more than human cousins have to offer, but to better hear each other with empathy, along with a willingness to not speak out, to not prove our point, as Gums puts it, but to listen with patience, dampening our impulse to be the conductor or a primary soloist. In case you think this effort to listen to the more than human is a fanciful but impractical notion, science writer Sonia Shaw recounts, quote, "In recent years, an array of findings have also revealed an expansive non-human soundscape, including turtles that produce and respond to sounds to coordinate the timing of their birth from inside their eggs, coral larvae that can hear the sounds of healthy reefs, and plants that can detect the sound of running water and the munching of insect predators. Researchers have found intention and meaning in this cacophony, such as the purposeful use of different sounds to convey information. They've theorized that one of the most confounding aspects of language, its rules-based internal structure, emerged from social drives common across a range of species," end quote. As I've been suggesting, there is intentionality and perception behind non-human animal soundings and listenings. There is now evidence that some have developed more than simply music. They have created language, a cultural attribute once thought to distinguish humans from non-human animals. And here I'm just going to bring in a short clip of science journalist James Nestor.
It's strange to do, but it's important to note that these guys are fascinated by whales. They don't necessarily want to free dive with them this closely, but they have to, because it turns out the only way to really study these animals up close is by free diving with them, by approaching them in your natural form and interacting with them in that way. Scuba doesn't work, it's too loud. Submarines don't work, same thing. Robots don't work, they freak them out. But when you free dive with them, this amazing paradigm shift occurs. And they not only don't swim away, but most of the time the whales turn around and welcome you into the pod. Sometimes they orient themselves vertically and do this very weird sort of new age thing around you as they're flicking. It's extremely intense. So the next question you're probably asking yourself is like, why research sperm whales? Well, it turns out that those clicks you heard, they aren't just used for echolocation. Sperm whales and dolphins also use clicks for communication. And inside of those clicks is probably one of the most sophisticated forms of communication we've discovered on the planet. Could be more sophisticated than human language. Now, I know that sounds completely nuts to all of you. It certainly sounded nuts to me when I first started researching this stuff a couple of years ago. But just consider a couple things. The sperm whale brain is about 6 times the size of ours. This is a picture of sperm whales facing us head on, and that top thing is their nose, and behind that is their brain. Now, sperm whales also have a neocortex. In humans, the neocortex is believed to govern higher level functions like conscious thought, future planning, and language. Well, sperm whales not only have a neocortex, but theirs is about 6 times the size of ours. Sperm whales also have spindle cells. These are long and highly developed brain structures that neurologists have associated with compassion, love, suffering, and you guessed it, speech. All of those things that make humans human and separate us from great apes. Well, sperm whales not only have spindle cells, but have them in a far larger quantity than we do. And they've had them for 15 million years longer than we have.
Peter E. Gordon, writing about the recently published transcriptions of Walter Benjamin's radio show in 1920s Germany, laments the arrival of the era of the earbud, writing, quote, "One can't help but wonder what this new technology is doing to our sense of shared public space, which is now fractured into millions of separate soundscapes, even while everyone may be physically navigating the same street. Can we feel the same responsibility for the places we inhabit when we no longer hear the same things? The risk is not only that the pedestrian misses the roar of the car that is turning into the crosswalk. The danger is that we may begin to lose the sense of belonging to the same world." End quote. Opening up our ears to empathetic listening requires that we put our earbuds and headphones away, at least momentarily, that we re-immerse ourselves in the noises and sounds of the everyday that many of us shut out as we move about our daily lives. If we can't stop to listen to those immediately around us, in other words, to hear other humans, how are we going to hear these more than humans whose continuity or extinction rests on our ability to be empathetic, to be present to their surroundings, to hear what they need us to hear? What does their singing mean to each other? What inaccessible sensibility are they singing into being that they think we should know about? What, pray tell, might they be trying to tell us that we need to hear? Thank you.
Wow.
So should we take some questions? Can we take some questions?
May I? First of all, I think this was amazing, and I'm trying to, you seem to be taking us in 2 directions, and I wanted to ask you about that. One seems to be kind of thinking through an ethical project from the space of a kind of radical otherness. And so you indicate that there's a relationship between that project and the project of aesthetic judgment. And I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about that. Because you come back to the bird song, but then there's also questions of sort of imitation, mimesis, right? As one way in which the project of aesthetic judgment is also a kind of ethical project, gets built out, I guess, in the tradition. The second question that I had was, it's weird that I found it weird. I think this is the way that I'll ask you this question. I found it weird that you speak to us about the needs for a certain kind of respectful empathy for how we think the more than human, as you put it. But a lot of the ways that we actually seem to be getting at that world itself seems to be mechanically mediated. Right, like, the work of the scientists and so I'm just kind of left wondering about this, right? Because it's as if like the highest level of mechanical reproduction and science takes us back to something that appears to be anterior or prior.
Right.
Or archaic. So I'm just wondering, like, methodologically, sort of what you were doing with that.
Yes, that's, well, that hits on a real thing I've been sort of pondering a lot, the second question. Right? So why am I always citing all these scientists and the way they think about this? Well, there's not many humanities doing this. Right? For one. So for two, a lot of the, even among those who are thinking about more than human, there is either reliance on sciencey sorts of rationales for making certain kinds of assertions, right? It's backed up. Look, they did this experiment. Of course, sort of side note on those experiments. Oh, sorry. The experiments themselves they're often cost the lives of like birds or bird song. Right? When they're studying bird brains and things, they're dissecting birds, right? So there's that question as well. So I wanted to be one of the voices on the other side of that division, or however we think of it, to begin to sort of grapple with why are the explanations always relying back, right, on a kind of, for lack of a better term, objective science explanations for these, rather than thinking about seriously, even as they assert that, oh, these are like cultural choices, there's aesthetic choices, right? But yet not diving much past that, right? So that's kind of where I see my space. And like I said, this is an early project. I'm just starting to really think through it. So that's kind of what, partially that whole dilemma actually is what motivated me to begin thinking about this. The first part, forgetting that.
Ethics and aesthetic judgment.
Yeah. Well, I quickly saw, like I kept hammering on, was the relationship between the way we think of ourselves separate from nature, separate from nature, is similar to the ways we set up internal intrahuman hierarchies, right? And so just kind of noticing that, right, it started like, oh yeah, there's a question of ethics here. There's now, especially as I allude to the aesthetic judgments of colonizers to the colonized, right? As one instance where that really is kind of a sharp contrast, right? Their music isn't as sophisticated, it's not as complex, right? Or whatever the reasoning might be, rationale might be, right? But, and so that it's in that sort of reflection, right? I mean, again, it's kind of like I remember taking an undergrad course in world music, right? And one of the things about Indian music was that, the melodic line is the all important thing, and harmony, that's, and is that true?
There is some literature that supports your presentation. It's a short story by Machado de Assis called The Canary's Ideas, where a canary there's an ornithologist who speaks canary, and listens to the canary who tells him that he's lost his mind.
Yeah.
And there's also
Persian Conference of the Birds.
Edward Morgenstern's poem of The Sounds of the Whale, which is just graphic.
That's right, that's right.
Graphic. So those may be attempts to address some of the questions that you guys.
Yeah, yes, thank you, thank you.
So I wonder just on the other side of that, if you, I mean, because in science, the few talks I've been to with neurologists, there's this very strong Darwinian school in neurology. And all the students, you know, this is like their Bible in a way. And, you know, in order to dissect, you have to really believe in the superiority of humans over species to, you know, be able to do that. So I wonder if just, you know, if this is kind of that side, you know, this is really a conversation to have with scientists also.
Yes, partly. I mean, I have an uncle, dear uncle, who's a neuroscientist of some kind, right? And I remember visiting him when I was in high school. And he took me to his lab. There was rows of monkeys with their skulls open. They're all still alive. Thanks now. And I was going through my big vegetarian phase, and I was like totally freaked out. Right? And sort of that kind of has continued to resonate, obviously, with me. And part of when I started finding out, I was, wait a minute, how do they know birds think, or, you know, reason they're doing this, or, you know, how they know that the certain, you know, mating calls, there's reactions that, well, they're taking apart birds, right? And that's when I started really sort of thinking about, like, okay, maybe we need a voice on the other side of, right? That's, well, what about those birds now, right? What about the agency of those birds, right? And there is a lot of, the way they push off is, well, that's the price you pay. Again, with that sort of human above, you know, that's the price you pay for the benefits that accrue to humans from those studies, right? Especially if you're, you know, thinking about medicines or something like that. But even with this work of bird songs and things, a lot of the rationale just end up being, well, look at the benefit for, you know, human knowledge. Yes.
Well, there's just two slightly different points. One is like throughout the entire presentation, I was reminded of coal miners in Appalachia would oftentimes bring a canary into the mine, and the canary would sing at slightly different pitches depending on changes in pressure. And it was for them, it was the most important way of knowing whether or not to exit the mine. So I thought a lot about that. But then the second point, which I found a little bit troubling, was the use of the word repair pretty often in your discussion of how we should engage with the world. And I'm reminded of something that I teach pretty often in introductory biology courses, is the, you know, bacteria, early life on the planet produced oxygen that killed the majority of life on the planet, right? And what is, you know, when we think about the nature of life on Earth, it changes over time, and life dies and life grows. So when we're thinking about repair, what does that mean for us, right? What are we going back to, right? What is this thing that we're trying to rebuild or recreate when you're using that word?
Yeah, that's a great, and something I do struggle with and thinking about, I guess I just haven't found it's my lack of finding a better way to articulate the move to, I guess, a more integrated human to more than human relationship. And is that, maybe it was never there to begin with, it's not there in some ways, right, to begin with. And so maybe it isn't a reparative move. Maybe it's a new kind of move, right? That maybe life on the planet Earth hasn't really seen yet, right? And maybe that's what's happening rather than repairing. And I'm trying to remember the story of the origin of the canary birds, but they were bred to be yellow. I mean, it was the canary that we know is a result of a lot of human intervention, right? And even why it's called the canary, right? They take it from Canary Island.
If there's time, I just wanted to, I was really struck by two examples that came towards the end of your talk and how they kind of contrapose each other. So Rothenberg, the musician performing with the Nightingales, which seems to be, even though there was maybe a bit of critique in how you presented it as well, but that wasn't probably a musical encounter sought by the Nightingale, right? I mean, it's still, there still is that. And then counterposed to that, this experiment at the African watering holes and the 19 species who were most fearful of human voices, and how striking that is. That is a form of listening, very mediated by technology, entirely reliant on technology. But look at what was learned there about how sound is perceived is just completely the opposite than assuming that the nightingale, it wants to be singing with you.
That's
Right.
right.
And that example is so striking too, because we have all these examples of the initial European encounters with other peoples that they assumed would recognize the superiority of their
They're happy
musicking,
to-
right? And Columbus's letter where the response was that this was obviously a sign of war, that they were making music that they thought were going to attract people, and instead it was interpreted the other way. So that was, I just found that a really striking example, and yet it seems so in the sphere of science and technology to have come to that conclusion, whereas this, individual who really seems to be bonding with the nightingale over the music, I don't know if you think a little bit more about
Yeah, we
what
can't
gave rise
ask the
to that
nightingale.
situation, right?
Yeah.
It's,
No, that's very true, and that's sort of, maybe I guess you heard like those slight skepticism, right?
Yeah.
It was like, is that happening? I mean, you hear them, listen to the recordings, I mean, they're widely available. And you could maybe, but then are we projecting now that, we understand it that way? I mean, that's really difficult to figure that out. Something else. Slip by. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much. So we'll take a 5-minute break to transition to our next panel.